talked to President Agent Mendoza. We listened to him. A presentation plan, but since things happened in Argentina, I had to modify the presentation a bit. And I want to start the presentation with a phrase from the former president of the nation, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner.
Con una frase de la expresidente de la Nación, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner,
who says Argentina is that strange place where even the obvious must be explained. So, given the aberrations and inconsistencies that her letter has today, and all the damage it has caused Argentina, well, I'm going to have explained the obvious. So, for Chris, greetings, Chris, this goes to you.
Saludos, Chris, esto va para vos.
In today's talk, I'm going to explain the approach we have taken to eradicate inflation in Argentina.
De hoy, básicamente, sobre lo que voy a explicar es cuál es el enfoque que nosotros tenemos para terminar de erradicar definitivamente la inflación en la Argentina.
And that implies a description of initial conditions, a diagnosis, and a design of monetary policy. Therefore, the ideal is, as Friedman said, first the data. Before that nefarious institution called the Central Bank of the Republic of Argentina was created in 1935.
Esa nefasta institución llamada Banco Central de la República Argentina.
The previous 50 years, Argentina had an inflation of 0.9% per annum. Then, in one of the greatest loopholes in the history of Argentina, in one of the most colossal scams that have been committed, in 1935, the central bank was created, a mixed central bank. And in the first decade of life of the central bank, between 1935 and 1945, the inflation rate jumped 6%. A rate that probably today in Argentina could even be celebrated, but for what with the standards of the time, it was a very, very high inflation.
Pero para lo que eran los estándares de la época era una inflación muy, muy alta.
But as that did not reach us, with this of having a mixed central bank, in the year 1946, the central bank was nationalized. And from then until 1991, the average inflation in Argentina was 240%. In the interval, we had 2 hyperinflations, even without having a war, and we added 13 zeros to the currency. And the generalized repudiation of the currency led to what was the most successful stabilization program in the history of Argentina, which was convertibility. Although between 1991 and 2001 the average inflation was 9%, it is true that this level of inflation was concentrated between 1991 and 1992. And from 1993 until 2001, Argentina was among the countries with the least inflation in the world. Later, when the state was left without funding and fell into default, instead of trying to put our accounts in order, they decided to scam us again.
De tratar de poner las cuentas en orden, decidieron estafarnos nuevamente.
In fact, if you look at the bills we had at that time, it said convertibles of legal cause, and today they are not. It does not have that designation.
Decía convertibles de curso legal, y hoy ya no lo son, no tiene esa consigna.
That is to say, they do not have the backing that those bills had. The political cash scandals again, but they did not say that this time it was going to be different, and it was not different at all.
o esta vez va a ser diferente, y no fue diferente en nada.
I am going to round out the numbers, I warn you, because later they will start with a number, the comma, I do not know what. I have been warning you for a long time that I am going to round them up. If I take the average inflation of the first period of the Kirchner regime, let's say with Minister Kirchner the head, the average inflation was 10%.
Periodo del régimen kirchnerista, digamos, con Néstor Kirchner a la cabeza, la inflación promedio fue del 10%.
In the second period of the Kirchner regime, that is to say, in the first presidency of Cristina Fernandez Kirchner, the inflation made a jump to 20% on average. In the third period of the Kirchner regime, that is, the second presidency of Cristina Fernandez Kirchner, the average inflation went up to 30%. Perhaps in the document that she published, she forgot to say that perhaps one of her ways of fighting inflation was to lie.
Se olvidó de decir que quizás una de sus formas de combatir la inflación era mentirla.
That is, it does not seem to us that the formula is to break the thermometer, the formula is to measure things. Or when so many are scared by the poor who are reaching poverty as well as going out of poverty is not something that is generated instantly. It takes time, it demands genuine economic growth. If it is not that it appears from one day to the next because it does, or it disappears from one day to the next because it does. And among other things, as the poverty index bothered them, they considered it to be a stigmatizing measure and decided not to publish it anymore. Of course, this is how it is easy. Making up numbers must be much easier to achieve than share the performance of a government. Well, it is not the way we have decided to proceed. We have decided to tell the truth because we prefer to tell an uncomfortable truth rather than a comfortable lie. If you want to make criticisms, start by making a self-criticism that is costing the country a lot of money, which is for having lied about the numbers or the disasters as they did, for example, with the case of GDP, which is also going to cost us a lot to all Argentines. But not only that, during the Macri period, the average inflation ended up climbing to an average level of 40%. So it is not a matter of inflation appearing now. In fact, Mr. Alberto Fernández, the autocrat, basically went with an inflation of 210%. But that is not reflect the dynamics that he had left, because as his government progressed, the inflation was progressing, and I remember when we had already won the elections. And we were doing and finalizing details to take office. During the first week of December, the prices grew at a daily rate of 1%. And the good thing is that I do not have to explain to you how a geometric type function works. That is, you know how to compute exponentials, and the annualized gives 3,700%. However, in the first 15 days of December, that is, during the second week of December, there was a stronger acceleration. The average inflation was 1.2% daily, that is to say that the inflation was traveling at 7,500% per annum. And when you computed the different imbalances that the Argentine economy had in the monetary plan, we were facing what was going to be the worst crisis in Argentine economic history. A crisis that combined a surplus of money that was twice what we had in the previous Rodriguez regime, an experiment that involved the sextuplication of the inflation rate. Not only that, we also had an absolutely broken central bank. It was in an even worse situation than the one that Alfonsín had at the beginning of 1989, which ended with a 5,000% hyperinflation in wholesale index. In addition, we have worse social indicators than those in 2001. Therefore, everything was headed for a disaster. In addition, we had the equivalent of 4 monetary bases within the central bank. But in remunerative passives that generated the creation of endogenous money, we had $90,000 million in equivalent pesos. We had external debt payments of $25,000 million, where most of it was with the International Monetary Fund. But the program was in default because the previous government had not fulfilled anything. Therefore, inflation was not generated by us. It was generated by these 20 or so years of wild populism. The reality is that we describe what we inherited, but we do not complain about it. Because we will also be sincere, in normal conditions of pressure and temperature, a Libertarian liberal does not win the presidency. Therefore, we are clear that the conditions under which we were going to arrive were going to be on the verge of total collapse. In that sense, for us, it was fundamental. In addition, my job description has 2 things, and it is very clear, which is, on the one hand, the demand to end insecurity, where this morning was that wonderful minister that I have, who was Dr. Bullrich, who is giving battle, and who, for example, has achieved the first mass homicide in Rosario. And the truth is that she is doing a truly exceptional job. So that part of the job description is going great. And the other part of the job description says that we have to eradicate inflation. So, as I was saying, wholesale inflation was traveling at 54 per month. That is, at 17,000% per year. And that was possible because what you needed was to validate the fiscal deficit. To validate the quasi-fiscal deficit, which the paces won one day. There was the problem of the debt in pesos. Therefore, everything validated that, plus the surplus monetary. And if you take the latest data of wholesale inflation, it is around 3%. 3% annualized is something like a little more than 20%. If you take away what we call induced inflation, which has to do with the 2% roll in PC and international inflation, that gives about 2.5%. The leftover inflation is 6% annualized. So this part of the job description we are also fulfilling, despite the fact that Pasilan and that some wasted so much, they refuse to recognize it. So that is how we got here. And now I am going to make a small introduction of monetary theory, which I hope that Chris takes out the notebook and pencil and notes. That what you have next to you will not help you at all, because they are the ones who generated this disaster. Basically, for one to have a diagnosis, they have to have a good theoretical framework. He has to understand what he is talking about, because if one does not understand what he is talking about, that of being betting on a type 2 error is not something that works recurrently. A type 1 error is to do everything well and that it goes wrong. A type 2 error is to do everything wrong and that it goes well. And it is clear that the theory won the cast by scandal. in terms of inflation being a monetary phenomenon. Now, to understand the nature of what inflation is, inflation is the loss of the power of money. That is a clearly different definition than a general rise in prices. Because I free you, inflation is the loss of the power of money. The loss of the power of money means that there is an excess problem of money supply, and the problem is in the central bank. If you think that in the general price rise you are going to blame the price holders, that is to say, then you are going to do price controls. It is a tool that for 4,000 years we have evidence that it does not work. So we have to understand the nature of money. Because clearly, I ask you for forgiveness for having to explain this. But clearly we have to explain the obvious. The colossus who is here, who is Federico Senega, and what you have to deal with the caste. Look, I thought that before believing that a central bank had to be eliminated. I thought that there could be a central bank, and especially when, without a doubt, one of the most talented economists in the world was in charge of a central bank with a truly exceptional grit. After what I saw what they did, I lost all hope, and I decided that the best thing that can happen is not having a central bank. But I will also explain that now. In that sense, what one would have to explain is where the existence of money comes from. So, what is the economy like when it does not have money? Well, it is a barter economy if you exchange goods for goods. Now, if you have a barter economy, you basically have two problems. One is the problem of double coincidence. That is, you have to find someone who wants the good that you have to sell. But at the same time, that person has to want the good that you have, which obviously raises a huge problem that causes a lot of transactions to be lost, with which there is a huge problem. And the other problem is the one of invisibility, because it may be that I want to eat bread, and the bakery in the corner wants an economic talk. But the problem is how many kilos of bread. I mean, obviously, those who, prior to being president, said, well, a few kilos I couldn't eat. So that raises a problem of invisibility, because perhaps what I would do for a kilo of bread at the conference is useless. Now, the thing is that the human being, in the face of that situation, did not stop crying. And he didn't call either, I want to go to the state. He didn't call the state either. What did he do? He found the way around, he solved it. He looked for the way around and he fixed it somehow. And one of the things that human beings discovered was that there were goods that were exchanged more than others. So they began to buy those goods that were exchanged much more. And they used them as an indirect exchange mechanism. Then, suddenly, they bought that good, and with that good, and they bought the one they wanted. That is how money appears. The good of indirect exchange is a good that is used to make transactions. That is money. So, in the face of this situation, different types of goods of indirect exchange appeared throughout history, and they were designated money. The first of all was cattle. And why was it cattle? Because as a nomad, man traveled with his own feed, that is, with cattle. So it was something that they exchanged regularly, and then they used it as a good of indirect exchange, and then the money was the cattle. Then man became a sedentary. And when he became a sedentary, one of the things that he ate with greater depth, so to speak, was bread. Then they noticed that many transactions were made in wheat,
muchas transacciones en trigo.
Then, later, we became the currency.
Se convirtió en moneda.
So, we have different types of currencies. We have, for example, linen, coffee, tobacco. In fact, there is a very funny phrase by Milton Friedman, who talks about hyperinflation in Germany. And they say that the nails were used as money and whiskey was also used. Sorry, not cognac. So, he said that it was the most liquid definition of money he had ever found in his life. In fact, if you look at the motives of many years of prisons, what was the money? Cigarettes. I mean, what did the prisoners ask for? They asked for cigarettes. Did they suddenly start smoking? No, they used them to exchange inside the jail. Now, what is the problem with this type of good? It does not serve as a store of value. I mean, what happened with this type of good is that it degraded over time. So, it's like having... Chris, note that I'm giving you another lesson. It's like having a negative interest rate. It's like ice cream. You have an ice cream. As time goes by, it's worth less. That's a negative interest rate. And in fact, what you have to understand, I can't tell you the price of the money, ma'am, because the interest rate exists regardless of the existence of money. The interest rate exists because time exists. The interest rate has to do with the mechanism of passing consumption over time. In other words, saving, which is future consumption, is a way of passing consumption over time. So, those who are indebted are the ones who advance consumption, and those who lose are the ones who defer consumption. And that is independent of the existence of the central bank. The interest rate has to do with the relative price of the present assets compared to the future assets. It has nothing to do with a monetary issue. It exists because time exists. Otherwise, there would be no interest rate. It would be a mess that has no explanation, like the case of Keynesian general theory. It's a mistake that we've been dragging around for a long time. But then, to try to preserve the value, we went to the metallic currencies. That's how gold, silver and bronze appeared. Gold was used for large transactions. Silver was used for smaller transactions. Probably the best-known currency of silver was the dollar, which is the dollar today. And in that sense, there is also another problem, which is the problem of portability. So, I made the example of the fox, so that the problem could be seen graphically. Then they started with the story of the fox, Robin Hood, the version of... I don't know, I talked about the version that I saw on the television of Lai Williams. I don't know the other versions. So, what I said is that, strictly speaking, I loved that version of the Robin Hood, because it's a real anarcho-capitalist. Because the fox, what did it do? It fought with the bad guys who robbed the merchants, and it fought against the soldiers. This is very interesting, because this is what surprises me. Because instead of capturing the abstraction, they say in the small letter, well, that's why we are as we are. Or maybe it hurt him so much. It darkened his thinking. Having said this, but Cristina was not speaking. Having said this, what was going on? If you are going to trade, what were you going to travel with? Either with goods or with gold. So it's like you were carrying a sign on your forehead saying, "I have gold, come and rob me, come and rob me." And what did the criminals do? They were going to try to intercept those carts because it was a criminal without an archer. There was gold there. And in that sense, what is interesting, that the Robin Hood fox was fighting against those criminals. Why? Because if they didn't get to the city with the get, then they had a loss of capital. The effects of the gold coins at that moment, they were going to be at a high level of prices, expressed in gold. And in that sense, what happened is that no one was going to bring them goods again. So it's as if they had closed the economy, with which they would have had a huge loss of well-being. So the Robin Hood fox was also a social benefactor, because it protected the rights so that the thieves wouldn't steal from the merchants. So it was also a supporter of the free trade, very liberal. But on top of that, it was fighting against monastery and others. So it was fighting against authority. It was fighting against the issue of tax payments. Therefore, the fox was a capitalist. No doubt about it. I mean, it could also be a capitalist, this time against the state, and be like the top of the state that comes to break it. Or perhaps what decent is to have lowered public spending by 30% only after the war, and there are no such great experiences. Having said that, then what did appear? Money or paper. Then you left the metal. You left it in one place, and then you went and paid with a certificate. Obviously, it wasn't missing, the one that made the bearer and issued the certificate, without having the gold, the silver, behind it. Well, obviously, it ended up in a couple of revolts, but the state that did it said, "Now I'm going to do it." And that's how they ruined our currency. So, and that's where the problems of society begin, and central banks are a relatively new invention. But here, the important thing, that we're going to pass your badge here, ma'am. Money is an indirect exchange property. I say that the future of history has turned it into a paper that is falsified by the central banks of the world. That's another problem. That's the great scam of history and humanity. That is called the central bank. But money is an indirect exchange property. And why is it so important to emphasize that it is an indirect exchange property? Because if it is an indirect exchange property, it means that it is a derived demand. I mean, let's see, guys, whose you are thinking of accumulating what currency, stake it to the wooden seat? I mean, it would have to be pretty stupid. I mean, on the other hand, it doesn't buy anything. I mean, it only buys here a fiction, which is the visualization that one makes. Or someone ever thought that the amount of ink in the dollar bill, as $2, of 5, of 10, of 20, of 50, of 100, is the same. The only thing that changes are the drawings. But there you are, making a mental representation of that. So what we have to understand is that in the end, the demand for money is a derived money demand. Why did they demand money? To demand goods. They don't eat money. They don't eat it. No. Take out a bill and try to eat it. But they don't eat it. So in the end, the demand for money is a derived demand. It's a mirror demand of the demand for goods. And this is interesting, because if it's a mirror of the demand for goods, all the macroeconomics books that say that the demand for money is a function of income and the interest rate, in reality, the demand for money depends on consumption, and obviously it depends on the intertemporal path of consumption. And if I want to take out the fact that it's depending, why am I dying? Where to put the income Because if I'm building a general equilibrium system, my income comes from a sale of leisure in the labor market, and it comes from the participation of the benefits of the companies. Therefore, I don't have to put the income. That's an aberration. That's a blow that Keynes made to be able to invent the effect of adjusting quantities and, above all, invent the Keynesian multiplier, which is to violate the budget restriction. Of course, by violating the budget restriction, of course, if he finances it with monetary emissions, it generates inflation, ma'am. Yes, it generates inflation. If you finance it with monetary emissions, it generates inflation. And in other countries that have a deficit, they finance it with debt, remuneration. That is not the central bank. Now, then, it means that my function of money demand now depends on my intertemporal path of consumption. I have to know where the demand for consumption comes from. If you do an exercise, you take a microbook, and when you look at the functions of excess demand, of general balance, or the function of demand for a good, what does it depend on? All the prices of the economy. That is, if the income does not appear, all the prices of the economy appear. And at the same time, if that economy is intertemporal, it includes today's prices, tomorrow's prices, and so on. The interest rate is implicit in the part of the price vector that contains the future prices. Therefore, let's say the money demand depends on consumption. And this is very interesting, because then, what does it depend on? In the end, the money demand that depends on consumption, that depends on those prices. Where does all this derive from? From what Robert Lakers Jr., in his last lecture, said. The profound parameters, and the profound parameters that are the function of utility, that is, preferences, technology, donations, and the type of economy that I have if it is a private property economy. Let's say, therefore, all those parameters are given. Therefore, in normal conditions, without someone shaking the economy, emitting money like a rat, path of consumption would be determined by these parameters, which have profound parameters that are given. Therefore, the classics were not so stupid when they believed that the money demand was granitic. Yes, of course, in normal conditions, pressure and temperature, it is something solid. In other words, if preferences do not change, the technology does not change, the donations do not change, and their intertemporal consumption vector does not change. Therefore, is the demand for money is a granitic structure, the real demand for money. What does that have to be equal to? To the real offer of money. Did you see that Muhammad Ali, or Cassius Clay, as they wanted to call photographers, if he said, "Get ready, the knockout is coming. Take the picture because another knockout is coming for," this says Cristina Fernandez Kirchner. If the demand for money is a granitic structure, this is the real demand for money. This has to be equal to the real sales. The real sales are the nominal amount of money over the price level. Therefore, the price level will be given by the amount of money that the central bank offers over the demand for money, which is this real demand for money. Therefore, when the central bank emits money, the only thing it does is change the nominal scale. That is, it increases the prices. Note that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess of money supply, either because money is emitted or because the demand for money falls, or both things happen. In fact, I'll tell you more. If you can get up, I'll tell you more. Come on, I'll give you back. In this context, when you have this situation, you generate a loss of the money's acquisitive power. This means that all the prices expressed in monetary units go up, and the dollars, one more price of the economy, What happens, I'll tell you more. There is something called the Catalan effect, which has to do with which are the prices that go up first and which are the ones that come back. So, for example, if you had a situation of a fall in the demand for money, that situation, okay, you don't demand domestic money. What are you going to demand? Well, in principle, they go and demand dollars. That is, they make a portfolio change. Then the price of the dollar jumps. Why? Because it's a financial asset. It adjusts quickly. Now, once that's happened, the price of the transfers rises. After that, the wholesale prices rises. After the consumer prices, finally salaries. That's why when you have an event of this characteristic, it destroys the workers. That is, it generates a tremendous problem. It has to do with a case of a fall in the demand for money. That is, it is not that the dollar makes the prices go up. It is not an early indicator in a scenario of these characteristics. And besides, it can't always be like that, because in reality, what could have happened is that you increase the money supply, then you see the demand for goods, then the price of the consumer prices rise. After that, the wholesale prices rise. After that, the price of the salaries rise. And after that, they don't give you the numbers. If it is not competitive, the type of change jumps. T realized that it all depends on where the excessive supply was generated. Ma'am, it is nonsense to say that. The type of change is the one that determines the rest of the prices. But then I will explain it to you later. Therefore, working with general balance seriously, not like fallacies, who say that they make general balance and they can't solve Allegrendian. So, I say and list about, in temporal cases, our diagnosis was and is, and will continue to be, that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by an excessive supply, either because the supply rises or because the demand falls, or both things happen at the same time. Therefore, in the disastrous scenario we had, that we were going to an inflation of 17,000%, with which the GDP fall would have been monstrous, and the number of poor would have been more than 90% of the poor, and more than 50% of the poor. That is, we would have replicated the case of Venezuela without a doubt. So our first fundamental idea was to end inflation, to attack inflation. I told you that during the campaign. I said that the monetary policy has a period of 18 to 24 months. I say that because it seems that to speak in Sanskrit. So they are all very in a hurry, and suddenly it is 9 months. Go and see my files, not the edited ones. See the original ones, not the dirty ones of the journalists, in excess, a large part, to deform the information and to lie. So go and see the original videos. They are there. So if the issue is to stop the monetary emission, how did we stop the monetary emission? So one of the sources of emission that existed was the financing of the tax deficit. When we reached the consolidated tax deficit between the Treasury and the National Treasury, there are 15 points of the GDP, where 5 are in the Treasury and 10 in the central bank. Therefore, the task, the central bank, and the finance secretary had in front, and I have the honor of having it, the giant of Pablo Kirchner and Vladimir. Hear him in here. They have been great architects fixing this problem. We had to attack those two sources of money creation. So what we proposed was the deficit era. I remember that during the campaign I would appear with a chainsaw, and they told me that I was crazy because I was campaigning with a chainsaw. In fact, we had broken the agreement with the International Monetary Fund, which was a huge problem to resolve.
para resolver
the broken agreement,
el acuerdo caído.
and in that context,
Y en ese
we decided
nosotros
to go to the
decidimos
fund
ir al
and show
fondo y mostrar
a plan of
un plan de
deficit era.
déficit cero.
The fund
El
was
fondo
kind enough for us
pensaba
to
que
fulfill
cumpliéramos
the goals
las metas
of the previous government.
del gobierno anterior,
Wait, ma'am,
donde señora
you all criticized their government, that you were also part of it. So,
Entonces,
in that
en ese
sense,
sentido,
we had
nosotros habíamos
proposed a
planteado
deficit era. Obviously,
obviamente que
just as during the campaign,
durante la campaña
they said it was impossible,
imposible, que éramos
that we were delusional,
y no sé cuántas cosas
and I don't know how many more things.
El
The fund with which we could fulfill the program that was in default by the disaster of the previous government was enough for us. We proposed the deficit era. It seemed something very ambitious because it implied an adjustment of 5 points of the GDP in the Treasury. And despite the fact that in the last 123 years, during 113, we had a fiscal deficit only in 10 that we didn't have. We were in default. It was the first time of these last 123 years that we reached the deficit era, but we didn't do it in 1 year. We achieved it in the first month of management. While that's management, obviously, all those who said it was impossible to do this, those who failed, we can't leave throughout history, and he should call themselves silent because they are part of the damage and destruction of the Argentine economy. They should have a little more humility, a little more confidence, a little more humility, or at least self-criticism. So, what happened? We ended up making an adjustment at the public spending of more than 30%. So they started to say that it was because we didn't pay, because we made year the numbers. But everything they said, the same thing that the lady says here, is far and late with those comments. Those comments were made in January, February, March. Today no one raises those arguments that belittle the task that we have done. And clearly, today it is understood clearly that this is a rule of monetary policy that came to stay, and that say now will go to the Congress to present the budget based on the law of deficit zero. And there, made that we stopped issuing to finance the tax. Now the fiscal quasi was generated endogenically that had to do with the retribution of the paid pesos of the central bank, and that generated 10 points of fiscal deficit, quasi-fiscal. And in that sense, we had to end the endogenous emission, and as we shared, while fiscal result was positive and accumulated financial excesses, the giant that is here, Mr. Pablo Colonel, could begin to recompose the curve in pesos, and being able to recompose the curve in pesos allowed us to withdraw the debt that was in the central bank and transfer it to the treasury, because in the end it was always the debt of a treasury. Because what was, for example, what Kaiserism did, it emitted money with fixed exchange lost reserves. Madam, we took the country with $52 billion of reserves and destroyed it. How much did Federico give you? Minus 5,000. Minus 5,000. Wonderful, madam. But apart from that, the problem of the future dollar, which was like $25 billion, and in that context, of course, when you met with text exchange, one of the things that happens is that you lose reserves. And what did they do? They put bonds on the central bank. They put the bond on the central bank, more than $100 billion, a real scam. And that's how they took the dollars. So, in fact, one of the things that the central bank did recently was to recognize that loss of capital generated by the previous government, by the FIOA, for example, of $45 billion. Not only that, but when we started doing this, nobody believed that we could fix the problem of the fiscal quasar. Moreover, madam, you at one point complained that the real interest rate is negative. I tell you that if we had listened to the economists who proposed to increase the real interest rate in positive terms, instead of having 4 remunerated bases regarding the existing one, today we would have 8, 9, 10. Today, it would be a discussion, and we would be clearly on the brink of hyperinflation. That we did something else. I tell you that the bridge you have next to you, I sent to study because you know what we did? We arbitrated the rate in dollars with the 1 in pesos, corrected by risk, obviously, and that made it. What about the devaluation? The devaluation, madam, was already there. That is, that you hide the data under the carpet does not mean that the devaluation was not there. The relationship between the parallel dollar and the official was close to 3 to 1. In fact, when we assumed the parallel was around 1300, the day it was at 1240. Oh, how the breed suffer. I don't care that our business is flourishing. That'll call the production of Vaseline for pithy serial economists. So, and that no one set out to fix, or that it was impossible, or that they proposed expropriations. We and these 2 giants that are here, Pablo and Vladimir, have made the fiscal deficit 0. What seemed impossible, we did it in 7 months. That is, in a month. We achieved the miracle of deficit 0. And in 7 months we achieved the miracle of ending with the fiscal quota. Well, there is management, gentlemen. However, it was not the only bomb that the previous government had left us. It had also left us the problem, the bomb of the puts, something that the previous government did as a fiscal deficit, and the International Monetary Fund decided to do it with a big I. And since the banks did not want to finance the treasury, they preferred to do it with the central bank. The puts appeared, but of course, countably, the puts only goes through the contingent, not through the contingency. But of course, in a scenario of macroeconomic debacle, that was in the money. And obviously, when we announced the part of the monetary program, which is access to man 0, it was stopped from issuing for the fiscal. It was stopped from issuing for the paid pesos. And we were going to a phase in which it was only issued by external sector. And we were sitting at the table with the banks discussing the issue. Other parts, the macro bank went and issued the equivalent of $2 billion. I mean, I want to know how many times in its life did they see that Argentina was attacked by the equivalent of $2 billion in 1 day, and the economy resisted. Another miracle. I mean, there is more force in the century than we think. In that sense, we could also take forward the issue of the pots. And in the face of the possibility that another situation of macro instability was generated, was Minister Caputo. He will be remembered in the textbooks as the best Minister of Economy and History. We decided in conference with Santiago Bossoli to go to a deeper stage of monetary policy, that is, to get to the zero-emission regime. Basically, the problem was that we, let's say, following the tax specs, got that the purchase of dollars was caused by demand of money, and therefore, if the demand of money was caused by the supply, that does not generate inflation. However, one of the things that was not in the textbooks and that we discovered is that when there is control of capital, which is necessarily true, what happens when you have free capital mobility, and if you want to make transactions in pesos, you go with your dollars and you buy the pesos from the central bank, and with those pesos, you have a real operation. Therefore, in that case, it is demand of money, and therefore, in that case, there is no inflation. The problem is that when you have CFO exchange controls, which we basically have to fix a problem of stocks that the previous government left us, that is to say, I did not stop being liberal libertarian. What happens is that I am liberal libertarian, not liberal libertarian. So I also understand the economy as problems of stocks and flows. So if I had a monetary policy for one day, if I had savings in pesos for the equivalent of $90,000 million, if I had $50,000 million of debt in the Sierra, and it is as if I did not disarm that bomb, it did not end well. It ended quite badly, which I understand is what the previous government wanted, that we act as libertarians, that everything was set on fire, and by January, let's say, after the sale of the supermarkets, another Peronist liturgy, they could return and definitely kill any kind of freedom. In that sense, we took economics seriously. That is, we did not pioneer economics in the textbook. So, in fact, what happened in terms of interest rates is a great triumph that we have also had in terms of economic theory, because what did the economists tell us? That we had to raise the interest rate. If we had raised the interest rate, the balance of the central bank would have exploded. In this way, having jumped the type of exchange to a level similar to the parallel exchange corrected by the country's tax. In that context, what happened? That the interest rate in dollars arbitrated with the one in pesos, but the one in pesos meant being negative in real terms, and that also allowed us to liquefy the stock of passives. So that you learn in monetary theory, it is not only a matter of looking at flows. The stocks are also looked at. And sometimes a problem of the stocks is much better than one imagines, because in fact it generated a quasi-fiscal deficit, which was twice the fiscal deficit. In that sense, we decided to go and to something more radicalized, because what happens when you have control of capital, which we need to have until we finish fixing the stock problems, and until we finish cleaning the money overhang will disappear. When the inflation is zero, the macroeconomics is zero, you have the absurd and the induced. The macroeconomics is the one in the middle. What is that residue? That today, the wholesale inflation is 0.5, the consumer inflation is 1.5, and that is going to disappear. In that context, what happens? When you have control of capital, the exporters are forced to liquidate in the market. And what is the problem with that? That the exporter is not necessarily buying money. What we do know is that he is selling dollars. And notice that when you have control of capital, and control of capital, wanting to buy money is not the same as having to sell dollars. That difference is fundamental, because then those dollars were not entering because they wanted money. These dollars are entering because there is regulation that imposes it. Then that generated an expansion of the amount of money beyond demand, and that is why inflation persists. That is why inflation persists, not because there are indexing mechanisms, because there is inflationary inertia. No, because this happened, because it was emitted more than what was demanded. So to correct this, we went to a deeper phase of the program, which is their emission. And it is not intervention, because the level of net intervention falls, because if I am liquidated $3, to put it in some way, and they made for $3, my level of intervention is $3. Now, if I have a gap and I return dollars so that the weights are constant, I suppose with the gap of 30, I have $1 left in the central bank, and I return 2 to the market. I am not intervening, I am doing that the amount of money is constant. Or what other way does it occur to them? What do they want? That they sterilize and pay interest rates again? Again? Tips. Syophilic. The intervention went from 3 to 1. Therefore, in this equilibrium there is less intervention, and it is much more similar to a free market equilibrium than to an intervention equilibrium. Why? Because when there is no intervention, zero intervention, what would it be like? The type of change is free. The variation in the amount of money is zero. And there appears another issue, the one now. The central bank does not buy dollars. That falls into default. Can it be that we are so rude? I mean, mobility is so great. I understand that. The doctor says this because she's not an economist. She's supposed to be a lawyer, but she does not show us her title either. That she was a lawyer. It seems that she does not know that. She is not part of her education. How do you think the delirium, that debt has to be paid with dollars bought buying the central bank in the market? I mean, what you are saying with debt is that they are going to go. They are going to remit money to buy dollars, and those dollars, the state, the treasury, is going to hand over the dollars, is going to return them to public titles, with which they're swindling them back, and they're swindling them with their own bribery. If you want, let's say, a more rudimentary version, easy to understand, although incorrect, the inflationary tax. So, what are you telling me? That I have to annihilate Argentinians with the inflationary tax to pay the debt? No, guys. The debt is paid with the tax surplus, not like an idiot buying dollars in the market and emitting money. That is the only thing that generates inflation. So for dollars, to pay the debt are bought with the tax surplus. What are we doing? And then I want to go to a question of a discussion of endogenous money, because it is incredible. The lady says that the type of change is the one that determines inflation or prices, or if you want, devaluation determines inflation. And man, I tell you that is to apply the PPP and say that the domestic price is the international price for the type of change. I tell you, lady, that this is consistent with the quantitative theory. In fact, you know what? A man named David Hume, who was later taken by Adam Smith, and was taken by the classics. Therefore, far from being contemplated, insight. If the domestic price level is determined in the monetary plan by the money supply divided by the real money demand, and that applies the same in the world, the type of change that is given by the local price divided by the international price means that it is given by what are called relative monetary conditions. I tell you the story. The local supply is divided by the international supply. The international demand is divided by the local demand. So if I say conditions of the world are given to us, if the amount of money rises, or if the demand for money falls, that impacts the prices, but it also impacts the type of change. We realize that they are not even consistent in what they say. In fact, it is also interesting to discuss that model, because, and then, what do they say? Well, the problem of inflation is a lack of dollars. I total nonsense. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Of course, they start from this idea that the local prices are the type of change multiplied by the international one, and that the type of change is determined by the excess, let's say, is going to be moving with the excess demand of debts. So, the solution is to export more if there is more demand for goods. It is strange. What is the other solution? To default, to restructure. And those are the solutions that they propose to lower inflation. They seem quite comical. You know why? Because in addition, they did all of them. And then they allege an external restriction, another stupidity the size of a house. How does the model of the external restriction exist? It stimulates the demand and makes the GDP grow. It makes the imports rise. And if it cannot be financed, then you have a limit to the expansion of the GDP by external restriction. Do you know where that happens? Because there is fixed price. The external restriction disappears. The external restriction exists. And a model of fixed price. If you release the prices and the fixed prices, that say fixing the type of change with tax deficit and issuing is what made all the reserves slide and destroy them. Today, Argentina should have, if they had done things in a reasonable way, today Argentina should have about $120,000 to $150,000 million for reserves, and we don't have them, precisely because of the monetary populism of the Kaiserism. So it is also interesting, because they say, no, the problem is not tax, because there is a hypothesis that says that the problem is tax, because I have a tax deficit. Why finance with monetary emission? And that's what generates inflation. It has nothing to do with the tax deficit. It's funny because it says that the problem is the excess demand of debt generated by the debt. I say, where did the debt come from? It came from a repossession. It's a tax policy. It's called a budget restriction. Try to see what happens. When you spend more than you earn, you end up in debt. And that pays interest. But that's starship. Because you ended up in debt. And who ended up in debt? For $450,000 million. The previous governments. I'm going to tell you something. We lower the debt. We are doing our job. Therefore, there is also a contradiction in its terms. But of course, they believe the prices are generated by a mark on the costs. That is the theory of value, the objective theory of value. That is, they went back to before 1871. I'll tell you something. I read Menger and I'm proud of that. In that sense, it is clear why they have caused so much damage to us and continue to cause so much damage. And it's interesting because this kind of stupidity is not only thought by the Kirchnerism. There are many more people who think of these things, and these things are the ones that fall to the middle of the table. Starting from being the richest country in the world in the last 50 years, we multiplied poverty at least 10 times. That is, in a country that produces fruit for 500 million human beings, and the fiscal year takes the 70%. That is, the food of 350 million human beings. There are 5 million Argentines who do not have enough to eat. That is the disaster that they generated. The entire political class generated it, not us who came to fix all this mess. And I'll give you one more piece of information, because they say, no, the fall of the GDP, it's very interesting. If you take the fall of the GDP in the first quarter, which is when we made all the thickness of the adjustment, in fact, we have reacted the adjustment. The GDP in the first quarter fell 5%. I remind you that being the Peronism in power in 2002 was in agreement with a man called Alfonsin. They were put to lie you are. And in that context, is very interesting, because they made a much smaller adjustment, and the GDP in the second quarter of the year, when they made the adjustment, fell 16%. Therefore, 5% is something quite remarkable compared to the fact that we made a much bigger adjustment. But I'll tell you something, because in the last quarter of the previous year, the GDP had already fallen 2.5%. And when you look at the destationing of the first quarter, it fell 2.6%. So let's say it wasn't something so alarming. And I'm going to tell you more. The other day I was having dinner with Professor Powell, and he made me notice something that I hadn't noticed, and that is that if you take the ME, which is the proxy of the GDP in the monthly version, if you take it to station and take the last observation against December, the GDP fell 2%. Therefore, not only are we making the biggest adjustment in history, we are reducing inflation, but also the activity didn't fall much. I understand this is very painful for the political caste. We are showing them that they are useless, that the only thing they do is harm, and that taking the me out favors us and is none. Council is something that improves our quality of life, not only because of what we gain in freedom, but also because we are more productive and more efficient. But they also predicted that we were going to have a social catastrophe, a catastrophe that we didn't have. Why? Because from the Ministry of Human Capital, while we were making the adjustment in parties that do hurt politics, today, if you take the universal seed card, today 99% of the basic freed basket is covered, when the previous government left it around 60%. Therefore, our social policy is also much better. But I'm going to give you a piece of information that is not in that correction. When Minister Patricia Bullrich decided to remove the social programs from DEMI, everyone shouted and said, oh, well, now they're promoting the strike. They didn't realize what were we doing. Look, what we were doing was very simple. When you handed over a social program, even though there was a card with which you charged, then you had to go and sign it. And that's where the coin was. That's where the managers of poverty appeared. Everyone was talking that they had to end with the managers of poverty. We are the ones who end with the managers of poverty. And that was achieved in the battle. From the first day they gave Minister Bullrich on the side of street control, Minister Patricia Bullrich was cutting this work. Because look how interesting, because now, if you didn't charge and you weren't forced to go to the marches because you didn't have to go to give the counterfeit. In the end, the counterfeit is that you went to the marches to make a mess. So, of course, when we announced that the counterfeit was finished, in a few days, Bologna announced a stop because we were cutting the mechanism by which half of the money was stolen from the beneficiaries of social benefits. And at that moment, he said that 50,000 people were going because, of course, he thought that 100,000 were going, and he showed it as a success. And the truth is that nothing more than 3,000 ended up going. There were more effective policemen than people, and that allowed us to win the street. And also, you have three types of war. You have the war that is against stocks. The one that finishes the bullets first loses. In some way, there is one that is flow. Let's say there is a spine, because it never ends. But there is one that is stuck in flows. The war that was being waged by the pickets and all the social flow was flow. That is to say, the state itself gave the money to those who broke things. And what did they say? That it was impossible to end the pickets. What did we do? We cut that cable, and it was a battle between flows, the state, and the pickets. Stocks were finished, and the pickets were finished. 4 months ago, what seemed impossible, we have been without pickets for 4 months. What management? Finally, coming to what the monetary policy is going to be and what the agent of the CEPO is going to be. Again, the first thing you have to understand is that I can't set dates. I understand that you have been mistreated by years of collectivism, but did any of you ever think about demanding the central bank every year where the interest rate is going to be? We need to know how much change is going to be tomorrow at this time, at this minute. It's delirium. You move forward with objectives, and the point is that these achievements depend on the decisions of the individuals. Therefore, it's endogenous. When could we end the repaid passes, and when the individuals end the debt of the treasury? That being said, we have the broad monetary base, and we have the observed monetary base, the traditional one. Therefore, as the traditional monetary base, as a consequence, the increase in the demand for money leads to the disarmament of repaid positions. You will not only have a situation where the two bases are mapped, but the opposite of that is that it is eliminated. The money overhangs and the inflation is zero. When I say zero inflation, I mean the difference between the observed one and the induced one. When we are in that situation, the only inflation that will remain is that the observed one is equal to the induced one, and we can open the nether, and we don't need dollars, because the demand for money is based on the supply of money. Why is this important? First, look at this, because this is very important. The economic activity, despite what they said, is recovering in a very interesting way, and that naturally leads to an increase in the demand for money. That increase in the demand for money, what happens? The companies need, you have to understand, they need to generate working capital. And if they need working capital, what are they going to do? Are they going to pay off? Or are they going to leave the money market? When they leave the money markets to demand working capital, which is the demand for money, you start to summing the A positions in the banks. And that is why the banks leave the pay positions and ask for cash. So that is generating that the demand for money does not lead to the traditional monetary base, to the wide monetary base. So, what is the great risk? So here is that we have constantly left the supply of money and the demand for money is growing. Obviously, what is happening in the middle is also that the money overhang is being cleaned and you are going to have less inflation. Once we get to that point, what is the problem now? The monetary base coincided with the wide one. It is that now the demand for money can continue to grow and the supply of money does not grow anymore. And in that case, what is the risk? The risk of deflation. And the problem is that since the speed of adjustment in the financial markets is faster than in the real market, the type of change falls strongly and leads to the collapse of companies and to a slowdown of economic growth. And what did we say about this? Monetary competition. Why are we talking about monetary competition? Let's suppose that two currencies were only the peso and the dollar. You can, and in fact you can do it today. The case of Taiko, who accepts that they pay in dollars, then you automatically, what are you generating? You do not have to be throwing the dollars in the market and generate a brutal appreciation. You start making transactions in dollars. The monetization of the economy will be done by individuals, as always. And they will do it by putting dollars and making transactions in dollars. And what is the interesting thing about this? That the amount of peso will continue to be fixed, that they will have a type of market change that will not experience a jump because supply and demand of dollars is mapped. And as there is more economic growth, there will be more dollars regarding the pesos. And at one point, the amount of dollars will be so much bigger than the amount of pesos that we will be able to close the central bank like this. And so the counter of Argentinian inflation will end for good. Thank you very much.